Hopefully it works. So now I'm just sharing the live YouTube link to Facebook in case anybody sees this and would like to join
Yeah, go ahead.
and possibly add comments as we're having the discussion.
Maybe also on the WhatsApp group.
Yes, I will do that too.
Perfect.
It always takes a little time to switch to each of the Facebook accounts and share the message with that account. So please just bear with me. Share.
Oops, sorry, I forgot I muted the Zoom call. So I was saying that don't worry, take your time. It's fine. While
Thank you, Prabhu.
all the accounts. It's because there is an alarm going on there and it's really noisy. That's why I muted a little bit. But I'm here. All
Okay.
right.
I didn't hear the alarm, so.
Oh, perfect. I will leave it at that.
Okay, one more place. And we are finished. Okay. So now I will share the screen. Can you see the presentation, Prabhu?
Yes, I can see it now.
Okay, wonderful. So, good evening to everyone who might see this video. My name is Krishna Keshava Das, and I'm here with Dr. Leonel Palacios, also known as Lochan Das Prabhu. And we are here today to discuss chapters 4 and 5 of Idols of the Mind versus True Reality, a book published in 2020 by the serving director of the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute, Dr. B. Madhavapuri. So the topic of the last part of this book is the unity of science and religion. And as you'll see in the presentation, it will bring together a lot of what was covered previously in the book. So first, we will just show some book reviews that were written for this text. This one is from David Lorimer, Program Director of the Scientific and Medical Network, based in London. He says, the title of this book comes from Sir Francis Bacon, where human concepts are thought to be objectively true, and it synthesizes a Vedantic approach with that of Hegel, grounded in the primacy of the idea, spirit, and consciousness. On the basis that there is no equivalence between organisms and machines, the author criticizes the attribution of metaphysical qualities to inanimate robots as a serious category error. Life and consciousness do not derive ultimately from matter. Interestingly, Nobel laureate and emeritus honorary member George Wald was persuaded by this approach on encountering Vedantic philosophy and switched his views accordingly to assert that mind had always been present in evolution. This book makes a sophisticated and significant contribution to an emerging science of consciousness. And here is one more, a snippet from the book review written by Professor of Psychology, Dr. Jennifer Like from Stockton University. She's also the faculty advisor of the Science of Life Club, which was organized in affiliation with the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute to study the topic of the complementarity of science, philosophy, and religion, which is the focus of our Bhaktivedanta Institute. So Dr. Like said, readers looking for a bridge between ancient Hindu philosophy and its Western counterpart will appreciate the general nature of this text. This book serves as a useful synopsis of the main arguments looking beyond materialist science toward a more holistic worldview. Although some readers will find the pace and breadth of Dr. Puri's arguments disorienting, others will appreciate its comprehensiveness and straightforward presentation. In any case, the message is an important one, as materialist philosophy continues to wreak havoc on social relationships and the environment around the world. So, first we'll address the title of this book, Idols of the Mind versus True Reality. What is this referring to? It's a very catchy title, but what is it referring to? It's referring to when human thought uses its capacity for thought in a way that is not receptive to reality as it is, or it's not observing nature in an unbiased way for scientists. Rather, they first have some biases or presumptions which have not been proved, and that colors their observation of nature in reality. So this book is not only acknowledging this, giving a historical and conceptual development of how this occurred, but also is trying to point in the direction in which this can be solved. So the picture we have here, idols of the mind occur within consciousness, which is symbolized by the thought bubble, and true reality is outside of the thought bubble. And if you take a look at the book cover, you'll see we have an elephant on the bottom of the book cover, and then there's a disfigured kind of odd-looking elephant in the top right. So in the next slide, you'll see that disfigured elephant is actually an idol of the mind. It's based upon the ancient Indic parable of the 6 blind men and the elephant, where each of the 6 blind men touch a different part of the elephant, without knowing that it's a whole elephant, because remember, they're blind and they don't know what an elephant is. They just are touching different parts of it without having any idea of the context of that isolated part. So one blind man touches the tusk and thinks it's a spear. One touches the trunk and thinks it's a cobra. Another touches a leg and thinks it's a tree trunk. Another touches the body and thinks it's a wall. And the last one touches the tail thinking it's a rope. So when they come together and they put together their isolated experiences, what they produce, what they conclude is this idol of the mind we see in the thought bubble of this very odd looking creature, which has nothing to do with or is very loosely related to what an elephant actually is. So in a similar way, modern scientists are coming to reality, or the elephant, but they're studying things in a very isolated way without considering the context of that isolated aspect of nature. And not only that, but they're coming with presumptions which are a result of a historical development that they're unaware of, and they're just kind of adopting these biases, such as thinking everything works in a mechanical way, thinking that life is reducible to matter, thinking that there's only physical stuff and thought stuff or mind is a product of that physical stuff. These are all unproven presumptions that color the practice of science as it's been practiced for about 500 years now. And so this book is going to address these things. So the first part of our presentation is called Humans Are Beyond Mechanical, Chemical, and Biological Explanations. So in order to illustrate this point, in order to describe this point, Dr. Puri gives a very useful metaphor of a book. How we look at a book from three different perspectives, and as we go up in perspective, a truer explanation of what a book is becomes apparent. The lower explanations do address a part of what a book is, but if we stop at that level, then we have a very incomplete description of the full book. So if we just describe a book as externally unified aggregate of paper, ink, and glue, where there are no relations among the parts internally, they're just simply externally unified, then we don't have a full comprehension of the book. It is paper, glue, and ink, that is true, but it's more than that. So we can't stop our explanation with this mechanical explanation. So we can now go up a level to a chemical explanation, where we notice that there are letters written on the pages. So it's not just the ink, but the ink is taking particular forms of letters, and there's patterns of letters. Certain letters appear near other letters frequently and predictably, but still, this isn't giving a full idea of what the book is. Of course, it has letters in it and paragraphs, and there are patterns of how words fit together. There are logic of language, but that doesn't describe what the book is in total. So still, we need to have a wider, broader, and deeper understanding of the book in order to have a complete explanation of it. So this is the biological level of explanation, the intention, purpose, or message of the author that is expressed through the written words on the page. Right? A book, the purpose of a book is for the author to present an idea. And the means for doing that is to take paper, glue it together, take ink, and write out words and sentences. But the whole purpose of that process is simply to express an idea or to express a purpose. So now this is helpful for thinking about living entities. Let's see how. So if we just reduce living entities to aggregates of atoms and molecules, which there are no inner relations among them, they're just simply held together by forces, we lose so much of what an organism is if we limit it to that kind of explanation. Of course, atoms and molecules are there, the forces which hold them together are there, no doubt. But simply reducing an explanation of an organism to that is detrimental to our understanding of an organism and affects, practical things such as medicine, how we practice medicine, and other aspects of our life. So similarly, if we try to reduce a biological entity to simply chemical reactions, saying that all biological activity is simply chemical reactions, we still don't have a full explanation of the organism, because the organism has purposes. It's behaving in a certain way as a cognitive entity, and the chemical reactions are happening as a result of those purposes. So in this little picture here for number 2, that's the chemical formula for cellular respiration. So the fact that cellular respiration is going on, that it, glucose, sugar, and oxygen transform into carbon dioxide, water, and energy, that's happening for a purpose which is beyond that chemical reaction. The cell is alive. It's making decisions to consume this, not consume that, to reproduce. And in order to reproduce, these kind of chemical reactions are supporting that process, but the decision to do that is being made at a higher level than just the chemicals. Chemicals are inert on their own. They're being utilized by a biological entity which has some decision-making capacities, cooperative capacity, it can respond in novel ways to unexpected circumstances. So we have to still go beyond chemical explanations to a biological level. The purposeful activities acting for the sake of themselves, the cells and organisms pursue, like respiration, photosynthesis, eating, reproduction. And this drives chemical reactions and it influences atomic phenomena. And only this level integrates the concept of a living entity fully. And it goes beyond the lower levels, but it includes them. So we're not saying mechanical understandings are not helpful. We're not saying chemical explanation. Of course, these are aspects, very real aspects of what a biological entity is. But we can't stop there, and we can't reduce the biological entity to them, because then we'll miss things, and it will affect a lot, negatively affect a lot. So these designations of, or levels of explanation, mechanical, chemical, and biological, this is the topic of the first chapter of the book. And as we now move forward, I have to just dive into a little deeper the philosophical, logical understanding of what each of them are and how they're different from each other, in order to explain the next part, which is how humans are beyond even biological explanations. So far, we just have biological as the highest level of explanation. But humans have a capacity for thought which is beyond non-human biological entities. So first, let's just talk about the logical differences between mechanical, chemical, and biological. When we say mechanical, we're talking about an object or a system where its parts can exist independently of one another. They don't have any internal affinity to unite with each other. And in order to become a system, an external force has to come to unite them. So simply, we can imagine blocks, on a table. The blocks are not going to construct themselves into something. Only an external agent has to come and apply that organizing capacity. Also, so this is a mechanical system. So chemical systems, they have an internal affinity for bonding, right? Chemicals are polar in nature. They have an internal affinity for bonding. So it's not simply just an external agent has to come and unite them based upon, how many valence electrons they have or whatever, what polarity they are. Chemicals will attract to each other. So it's a higher level of explanation than mechanical. but they continue to bond. When they reach a state of unity, it doesn't persist. It continues to bond. Biological entities, on the other hand, when a biological unity remains what it is, and when it interacts with something other than itself, it turns it into itself. So this is when we can move on here. So what we mean by turning it into itself, when a chemical object encounters another chemical object, they will transform into something that is different than either of the two. When chlorine and sodium combine and become table salt, they go from two elements which are toxic to something which is nutritious, right? When the gas hydrogen and the gas oxygen react and combine, they become a liquid. So the product, the whole that results from the two parts, is something completely different than the two reactants. With a biological entity, when a bear encounters a salmon or a blueberry, or a cow, we have a picture of a cow here, encounters grass, it's not that they react like two chemical reactants and become something totally different. Rather, the cow will eat the grass. The grass will cease to become what it is. It will disintegrate, and it will reintegrate with the cow. So the cow is taking something which is other than itself, and it's making it itself, right? A bear is a completely different living entity from a salmon or a blueberry bush, but it has the capacity to then take that other living entity and make it become itself. It eats it, right? You digest the food, and it gets redistributed how the body needs, and the consumer's self is preserved and is maintained. It doesn't become half salmon, half bear, right? It's just the bear remains the same. So this is a different way to think about what's going on, of course, in nature, but it's true, and it gives us more of a capacity to see what are the categorical differences between these levels of explanation. So what this is really getting at, why this is happening, is it's a matter of identity. When we say identity, we mean what a thing is, what makes it what it is. So this is derived from Hegel's philosophy, actually, but it gives us a very helpful view of nature. So any object has its identity in its other. The object as it appears to us immediately, its identity is based upon its relation to otherness. That means fundamentally everything is relational. So how do we demonstrate this? In a mechanical object, we might say that the boundary of a mechanical object is its surface, right? The surface of a pool ball, the surface of a gear. But that surface of a gear, right? We have a picture of a gear in the lower right corner. The surface of the teeth of the gear take that form because of its relation to other gears, right? So that shape of the object is being determined by its relation to something outside of itself. A pool ball is spherical so that it can roll across the surface of a pool table. So the identity is based upon something outside of the object itself. It's not inherent in the object as an isolated thing. There's no such thing as an isolated thing. Everything is relational, everything is connected, and that even determines the very boundary or surface of these objects. But because mechanical objects don't have a capacity, so we observe this, mechanical objects don't have a capacity to unite with each other. When a pool ball hits another pool ball, they bounce off of each other. They don't combine, right? When a gear meets another gear, they rub against each other. They don't merge together. So this is the external nature of mechanical objects. They can't find unity with each other. So in Hegel's philosophy, it's described that this is called the tragedy of the mechanism, that although its identity is in its other, it can never unite with that other. They only confront each other and bounce off of each other, repel each other. That changes when we get to chemical systems, chemical objects. So again, the self of a chemical object is in its other. That's why they continue to bond. They're polar. They're always seeking to bond with something. An element is always seeking to bond with something outside of itself. And so in the same way, the same logic, how the boundary, how the form of a mechanical object is determined by what is other than itself, in the same way, the chemical is like that. When we say when we say a compound is positive or negative, or we say an element is negative or positive, it's only in relation to something which is opposite from that, right? We're saying its identity as negative, that's only in relation to something which is positive. Being negative or positive has no meaning unless there are things which have the opposite charge. So they're being defined by something which is other than themselves, and that's inherent to what the object itself is. Now, chemicals have the capacity to merge with each other, to bond with each other and produce a new product. But like we said before, it keeps on going. It never is satisfied. It never finds a stable unity. The biological entities, again, they are being driven to unite with their other because that's where their identity lies, and that's what drives their consumption of other entities in nature. And they're able to maintain that unity until they have to reproduce. When they try to unite with their other through a sexual union, right, in order to fulfill their capacity to reproduce, they can't consume the other. They have to leave it as it's existing outside of themselves. And this kind of frustrates the instinct to try to possess everything and take it for itself. This is part of Hegel's development of these four categories and what makes them different from each other. So finally, the human being has the capacity to merge with its other, not to merge, but to unite with its other in a manner which doesn't require its destruction. That happens through thought. When we think about something, we're able to integrate it into ourself without having to destroy it or to consume it. Right? When an animal has to eat another animal, they're destroying that thing. But when a human has a capacity for thought, they don't have to destroy it, right? They're able to think about it in a very deep way without affecting its existence. So this capacity for thought allows human to unite with other, but also maintain the difference. So this unity and diversity principle is there in thought. It preserves the diversity, but it's also enabling a unity. So the point of this whole development is to establish that human has this very unique capacity for thought, which allows it to interact with from a natural perspective, allows it to interact with the environment in a way that nothing else in nature can. This thought that humans have is self-conscious. We're able to be aware of our own thoughts. We're able to not just think and be conscious, we're able to be aware of that process as it's happening. Animals which are conscious don't have the capacity to reflect on what they're conscious of. So this is all to establish this principle, the self-conscious thought of a human being. Now, before we move on, yes, I was just going to ask Prabhu, please.
Yes. A quick question. With regard to the previous table in the previous slide,
Yes.
No, please do that that way. Can you explain again why the biological and chemical explanation disturb the unity?
Yes. So, for instance, the unity is disturbed in a chemical system when hydrogen and oxygen become water. Although water is a very stable product, still it will react with methane, right? It will become like a methane crystal. It will become something different from water. So it's still the same kind of process of it will become a reactant to a new product which is different from itself. The propensity to continue to bond never stops with chemicals. They're always having that a propensity to bond. Even if it's a stable product like water, still it can become something else, like a methane crystal, right? When the methane freezes and it becomes a different substance. So the biological object is superior to the chemical in the sense that the unity is maintained. The bear remains a bear. It can consume the fish, it can consume the berries. That doesn't change it from being a bear. Its unity, its identity is right. It's a self-maintained unity. The bear will eat and it will integrate what is other than itself into itself, and it will remain what it is. That's different from the chemical bodies because they completely change when they become a new product. Like we said before, the oxygen is a gas, hydrogen is a gas. They become a liquid when they become water. The chlorine is a toxic substance for humans. The sodium is a toxic substance for humans, but they react and become table salt, which is nutritious. It's a totally different substance. So when biological objects interact with the other, they don't completely transform like that. They maintain the integrity of themselves and they assimilate that otherness into themselves. So that we're using that as the standard for saying the biological entity is superior to the chemical entity because it can maintain that unity. But even that is disturbed eventually when it comes to the reproduction. If the propensity of the biological entity is to always consume its other and integrate it into itself, this is an instinctual thing. Now, when it comes to so the biological entities, they have instincts. That's what's driving their behavior. And when they have the instinct to reproduce, they also similarly try to claim what is other than themselves, but they can't consume it, right? They have to, in order to reproduce, they have to leave it alone and they have to interact with it in a different way. They have to have sex with it. But, and this is described in something we're trying to write, it's an aggravated event. Right? When two animals mate, it's a very aggravated and aggressive act because their instinct to claim what is other than themselves and turn it into themselves is stifled because they can't consume the other. They have to leave the difference, and then they mate, and then they run. And most animals don't pair or anything, right? They go back on their own. So this disturbs the capacity for them to integrate things into themselves. It disturbs that capacity to integrate otherness. So the human being is superior and it has the ability to overcome that obstacle. A human has a capacity to think and intimately know things in a way that doesn't destroy their otherness, whether it's even in the act of love as well. They're able to assimilate otherness through thought. They're able to see the union of things while remaining distinct from each other, right? They're able to see the relationship without needing to destroy that other. So this is we're calling a superior capacity, and this is because humans have thought. And now the idea is to try to go deeper into what is this human capacity for consciousness or thought. And again, we recognize that this is a very different way of thinking about mechanical, chemical, biological objects, but it kind of reveals something which is normally not talked about, I think, and it's logical, it's consistent, I find it very intriguing. Is that okay, Prabhu?
Yes, thank you.
So analyzing human consciousness. Non-human living entities are conscious to various degrees, but only humans can develop self-consciousness, or an awareness of their conscious nature, or self-reflective awareness of the content of their consciousness. This is an instinctual consciousness versus a rational consciousness. So the human rational consciousness gives rise to a second nature of culture, government, art, science, religion, and philosophy, which strive to consciously express that self and comprehend its environment. So non-human living entities don't produce government, art, science, religion, and philosophy. An animal doesn't understand the whole of which it's a part. It doesn't understand that it's living in a world, what to speak of a government. Right? This is a point Dr. Puri often makes, that the world is in the mind. We talk about the world as if it's an external existent thing, but the world as a totality of all things, if we define the world as the totality of all things, that only ever exists in our mind, because our senses are only aware of a very small subset of things. Even if you want to say, you can see the world if you go to space, well, when you're looking at planet Earth from space, you're not seeing the dog in the street in India. So still, you're not seeing the set of all things. You're just seeing a subset, the surface of the globe of a planet. So the world as the totality of all things really exists in the mind. That's what it is. It's a thought. It's an idea. And animals don't have access to that kind of concept of a world. They don't know they're living in a world. They're just having some immediate awareness of their environment, and they respond in an instinctual way. And it's not a self-reflective act. They have, and we can say that because we don't see a second nature, which is an expression of that self-reflective capacity. In order to learn more about it, we don't see that manifesting in the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom. That's only something that happens in human civilization. Okay, so also we can say that the human being who doesn't understand this self-reflective capacity of the human being is only a human in potentiality. They haven't actually become a human being, or they haven't tapped into what the full capacity of a human being is, a self-reflective entity. Finally, humans have to transcend biology to truly function in human civilization. So, as we said before, the biological entity has chemical aspects, of course. It has mechanical aspects. Similarly, the human being, of course, has biological aspects, has mechanical and chemical aspects. But if the human being is solely acting on the level of biology and hasn't risen to what makes a human being distinct from the rest of non-human biological entities, then they're not able to truly meaningfully engage in human civilization, which is supposed to be expressing a self-conscious entity, comprehending the capacity of this self-conscious entity, right? So now we're gonna dig more into this. We explained this. This picture is just supposed to illustrate what we said. The animal has an awareness of its immediate environment. Of course, it's conscious of what it wants to eat and how it needs to protect itself against predators and how it needs to mate. But it's not self-reflective of this. Rather, human beings have the capacity to understand the full context of the experience. Now, due to the self-reflective capacity of humans, They want to know beyond the mere appearance of a phenomena. They want to know how humanity can benefit from this knowledge. So this is what gives rise to science, right? Not only does human find themselves in nature, but they want to understand nature and how humans can benefit from it. So modern science has emerged. Now, depending on the unique perspective and needs of the observer, as it turns out, the observed object appears differently. So now we're getting into territory which is different than how science has normally thought over the past 500 years. Normally, science presumes one of these unexamined presumptions that the observer occupies a third-party position, and by observing nature, there is no interference with what an object is. So it can be studied in an objective way. That's the presumption that science makes. But what that does is ignore the role that consciousness plays in observation. And it ignores the primacy of consciousness ultimately, which is where this presentation is going. So, in order to demonstrate what we mean, we turn to the field of biomimicry. So biomimicry is when scientists or engineers look to nature in order to find designs which would solve problems in human civilization. So for instance, this bird that we have on the screen is called a kingfisher. Kingfishers have existed for a very long time on planet Earth, right? For civilizations in Borneo, like Aboriginal cultures in Borneo, they're an omen of bad things to come, right? For a conservationist, the kingfisher is an endangered species, or their habitat needs to be preserved. But for an engineer who's practicing biomimicry, the kingfisher has a beak, which is actually a model for a bullet train in Japan, right? They have a train in Japan that when it's very fast, it's called a bullet train. When it exits a tunnel, it would make a loud boom, and it would disturb the environment and the people living there, and they wanted to solve this problem. So the engineer who was working on this bullet train was also an avid birder. And he would go out and observe the birds, and he would watch the kingfishers dive into the water to get their fish. And he noticed that when the beak of the kingfisher pierced the surface of the water, it wouldn't splash. So he could understand that the geometry of the beak was such that it could pierce the surface without causing an explosion or causing some perturbation. So he said, hey, what if I put the geometry of that kingfisher beak on the front of my train? Then maybe when it exited the tunnel, it wouldn't make such a loud sound. And that's exactly what they did, and it worked. So the point here is that depending on the unique perspective and needs of the observer, the observed object appears differently. The kingfisher isn't simply a conglomerate of atoms and molecules, neither is it a conglomerate of chemical reactions, neither is it just a bird on a tree. It's also a model for a bullet train. Who would have thought? It really is a model for a bullet train. So this object is appearing differently to the observer based upon the needs of the observer. So this is showing that things are not as concrete and rigid as we've thought for so long. Ultimately, this observation demonstrates the interdependence of the moments of consciousness, which is what we're about to get into. What are these moments of consciousness? But before we get into the moments of consciousness, we just give a little more details on these points, and we kind of foreshadow what's about to come in the presentation. So this notion that the object appears differently based on the needs of the observer, actually this has been affirmed by quantum physicists like Werner Heisenberg, who is one of the pioneers of quantum physics, who told us that science is not a study of nature as it is. Rather, it's a study of nature as exposed to the questions of the scientist. It's a relationship between the scientist and nature. So the questions that scientists pose, which shape their experiments and the formation of scientific facts, those questions are based on the needs and perspectives of the scientist. It's influenced by the presumptions that they had because they've inherited them from a scientific culture which used to be based on natural philosophy, in fact, and inherited a lot of philosophical presumptions from that, which are not empirically verifiable, but they don't know about that. So these just became implicit assumptions in how they frame questions, which then they observe nature, and the observations are filtered through these kinds of questions which have biases which haven't been examined. So this is something that needs to be recognized and acknowledged and dissected. It can't just be ignored. And ultimately, our coming analysis of the moments of consciousness will disprove axioms or presumptions like physicalism. And it will show that consciousness is really the prime position. Consciousness is fundamental, and matter is actually a result of consciousness or a product of consciousness. So there are 3 moments of consciousness which we'll talk about. Lochan Prabhu, are we okay to continue?
Yes, please.
So there are 3 moments of consciousness that we'll discuss. Knowing. Let's start with the known. The object or observed is called the known. The subject or the observer is the knower. And the subject-object relationship or observing or observation is knowing. So these are 3 moments that should be identified. And now knowing occurs, that subject-object relationship occurs through our 5 senses. That's why we have this picture in the thought bubble. We can observe objects through hearing, through smelling, through tasting, through seeing, and through touching. So when we say self-consciousness, we're returning to that idea of self-consciousness. What we mean is that the subject or the knower takes themselves to be the object. So not only can humans know about apparently external objects, they can take themselves to be an object of their own consciousness. We can observe our own behavior, right? Anyone has experience, we can observe our own behavior. We can think, oh, why did I do that? Why didn't I do this? This is all self-reflective activity. This is taking ourself as an object. So it's just important to point that out so we understand what we mean by self-consciousness. So now we had mentioned that by understanding these moments of consciousness and the implications of their relationship, that it will disprove or invalidate the presumption of physicalism. So in order to do that, let's just briefly talk about what physicalism is. What is it saying? What is it presuming? So physicalism is presuming that observed objects and observers are external to and independent of one another. We can't just simply think that's a fact. We have to accept it's an observation. Why do we think the observer is external from the object? Right? That's a presumption. Number 2, physicalism says that the physical objects are fundamental to reality. And 3, that consciousness reduces to that physical object, or matter in motion. As it turns out, this is contrary to our direct experience of consciousness. These 3 presumptions that underlie physicalism, they're contrary to our direct experience of consciousness. So let's start by this. If an object is simply existing external to the observer, and the relationship between the knower and the known is a relationship between 2 things which are external to one another, then how can we have this kind of discussion? This discussion that we're having right now is evidence that all three aspects, the object, the subject, and observation, all have the capacity to be contents of our consciousness. We're thinking about them right now. Objects, our only experience of object is in consciousness. Without being conscious, without being aware, you have no evidence of any objects. You have no capacity to think about a relationship between yourself and that object. That's all happening in consciousness. So we're trying to unpack that. So in order to move forward, we're going to talk in terms of consciousness and a content, the content of consciousness. But when we say content, we mean object, subject, and their relationship, that these are all contents of consciousness. In order, we're just making a final point here, right? All we have is conscious experience. When I touch my computer and I feel it's smooth, I see it's black, and I'm thinking, well, this is real. This is not just my consciousness, this is real. But those things, I'm conscious of the feeling of it. I'm conscious of the sight of it. When I drop the phone on the desk, I'm conscious of the sound of it. To think that this is existing outside of my consciousness is to make a huge jump, because all I have is conscious experience. All any human has is their conscious experience. So to say something exists outside of consciousness is an activity happening in consciousness. And so we're going to unpack that in a moment. So physicalism, spiritualism, and agnosticism, these are all experiences in consciousness. To assume that matter is fundamental and that consciousness is a product of matter, this is happening in thought. To say that consciousness is fundamental and that matter is derivative of that, this is happening in thought. But it's more coherent because it's in agreement with our experience that all we have is conscious experience. So we're saying that the capacity of a given worldview to acknowledge the fact of the fundamental nature of consciousness and to help people better understand that is a sober and unbiased rational standard by which to judge the validity of a given worldview. So acknowledging that everything is happening in our consciousness, touch, taste, smell, all of our senses are happening within or as contents of consciousness. How do we get to the place where we think that the content of consciousness is separate from consciousness and that consciousness has to be explained in terms of that externalized content? How did that happen? This is supposed to be a little picture demonstration of how that happens. Right? Consciousness makes the presumption that its content is outside of itself. It presumes that the externally projected content is more important than itself. Then consciousness forgets that it did this. And because it's still conscious, the nature of consciousness is to be conscious, but now it has forgotten that it projected content outside of itself and presumed that it's important. What's left is the presumption that here is some external object, which is very important, and I'm left with this conscious nature which has no recollection of what it is. So the only thing that remains is for me to explain this consciousness by this external content, which can never happen, by the way, because any amount of putting atoms and molecules together has never produced a mind, right? Like science is based on demonstration, so if you're saying consciousness is based on matter, then produce it. You can't, it's never been done. And to say that, well, it correlates with these neurons firing, right? We know that correlation does not mean causation. So Maharaj has given a whole chapter about this. When ancient Chinese would watch the eclipse happen, they would bang a gong. They had a very mythological worldview where they thought that by beating the gong, the sun would stop being eaten by the moon. And because the eclipse always passed, they equated their correlation of beating a gong to the passing of the eclipse, that they caused that. But causation is not, a correlation is not causation. Similarly, what is the other example? I'm forgetting the other two examples he gave now. But the point is that correlation is not causation. The fact that two things correlate, you cannot jump to say they caused it. That has to be demonstrated, and if it hasn't been demonstrated, then it's simply a presumption in consciousness. Again, this is something which is proven at every step of the way throughout any kind of system of knowledge, because system of knowledge means you're conscious and you're trying to know. You can't get out of this conscious experience. Any rebuttal to the fundamental nature of consciousness is coming from a conscious person. Without being conscious, there's nothing to speak of anything. I mean, it's a back to basics kind of thing. It's not, the idea isn't a more complex idea. The idea is retracing our steps backwards and recognizing how some of our presumptions, that they are presumptions and they haven't been proven, and that they are occurring within a conscious context. Anyhow, hopefully the message is getting through. Maybe I'm not explaining it as coherently as I'd like to. So, science typically tries to understand things in isolation from one another, but this produces abstractions or idols of the mind because everything is relational. Similarly, consciousness cannot be understood apart from its role as an instrument of the individual self and universal self. So now we're moving forward with this recognition that consciousness is fundamental, and how we can't stop there. Consciousness always implies a self, the conscious self. So this is to kind of prevent us from going in the abstract direction that some bodies of thought go in, where consciousness is all there is. But that has no meaning. That's very, there's no meaning to consciousness without that which is conscious, without a self. Just like there's no meaning, so it's a tool, right? Consciousness is an instrument of that self. So there's no meaning to a hammer without a carpenter who's utilizing that hammer. An instrument has no meaning unless you are also considering who is wielding that instrument. So the senses are instruments of the intelligence. The intelligence, which is a discriminating, has a function of being discriminating this or that, is also an instrument of consciousness. And similarly, consciousness is an instrument of the self. So the self is not limited to just expressing itself through consciousness. It also can express itself through love and joy. But these are all things that are interconnected. These are all within the conscious experience of the self. And then lastly, the self as a finite entity is itself an instrument of the infinite, or the supreme self. So this talk is called The Unity of Science and Religion. When we can understand from our direct experience that consciousness is fundamental, and we can understand that that consciousness is an instrument of a self, but that self is finite and always relies on something outside of itself, then there becomes a necessity for something which is infinite, something which is infinite, which does not rely on something outside of itself, which relies only on itself, which is self-caused and is the foundation for all finite things. Because if you don't have that, then you get into an infinite regress, which is illogical, because there must be a starting point which is self-caused. So this is that development of a consciousness-based science which leads to a theistic conclusion. There needs to be an infinite foundation which is self-caused for this finite dependent consciousness to exist. So the last point here is that the tendency of the self to isolate itself from its instrumental function produces a false sense of self. So this point is saying that when the finite self does not want to acknowledge that it's an instrument of something greater than itself, then it isolates itself from its context, and it produces an identity which is based on transient things, which is fictional. So all finite entities, all finite things are based on that which is so when we say finite, it means it relies on something outside of itself. In the most familiar way, we're talking about a living entity breathes air, it needs sunshine, it needs food, it needs all these things outside of itself. When we go beyond the identity of just a body, when we're on the consciousness level, still that consciousness is finite, still it's depending on something outside of itself. So that's why the necessity for the absolute is there. But when the finite consciousness doesn't want to recognize its relationship to that absolute, then it puts itself in this illusory position where it's constantly trying to identify with these finite things which have no ground in themselves. They all require that absolute foundation, and it will only result in a confused experience unless it recognizes its relationship to that and then really deeply starts to embody its role as an instrument of something beyond itself. So this is the last part of the presentation now. Everything is floating in consciousness. So please, before we move forward, Lochan Prabhu.
I just wanted to make an observation. This last explanation you gave was really good. And so, yeah, it was just that comment. I like it very much. It was quite illuminating. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy that I said something coherent. Okay. And it's only happening by, so this is all a study of the work that Dr. Bhimadeva Puri has done of the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute, and anything I'm saying is just trying to share the ideas that he has made public and taught to others, including myself. So we're thankful and grateful to him for providing this kind of consciousness-based spiritual education to us, which has deeply helped our own sense of purpose and fulfillment in this world, and our own theistic worldview, and our own view of how scientific a theistic worldview can be, not simply based on sentiment or emotion, but there is a scientific, rational foundation for theistic worldview. I had never encountered that before meeting Dr. Puri and the Princeton Bhaktivedanta Institute. So this is the conclusion now. Everything is floating in consciousness. So recognition that consciousness is fundamental to reality has existed on Earth since ancient India's Vedic culture, based upon knowledge from the four Vedas. Texts such as the Vedas, Vedanta Sutra, and Srimad Bhagavatam are based on this foundation. The first verse of the first canto, of the first chapter of the first canto of Bhagavatam says, Janmadasyata navyad ittaratas charteshva abhigyasvarat. This translates to everything is born from that which is cognizant and independent. And now we are reiterating that this is an unassailable position because any refutation itself is based on consciousness, is coming from a conscious entity. We can't escape that. And it's recognizing this fundamental nature of consciousness is a simplification of all these presumptions that have clouded our collective mind over the course of so many years. It's a simplification and recognizing that these are all existing in consciousness. And if they start to try to lead us in a direction that has to ignore that, then something is wrong and we have to retrace our steps and really humble ourselves in order to do that, because that means admitting that we went wrong somewhere, and that's not something everyone likes to do. So this idea has been known throughout history, as we are showing, for thousands and thousands of years in ancient Vedic culture, which is why so many ancient civilizations saw everything as conscious, even the moon and the stars. Although this is opposed to the current modern scientific viewpoint, it's irrefutable, due to consciousness being at the root of all arguments. It's inherently true, and a commitment to this unbiased intelligence, and a commitment to unbiased intelligence requires accepting this fact. If we want to be unbiased, then we need to relinquish commitments to collective presumptions which we feel comfortable abiding by because we have some sense of social security by being surrounded by other people who take these assumptions to be true. But that's a very false sense of security, because it's causing us to ignore this fundamental, most basic aspect of our human existence, of our existence as a living entity, that everything is based in this consciousness. So we need to go back to square one. We need to go back to the ABCs. Genuine progress forward of scientific knowledge of reality is only possible when we go back to this fundamental starting point and then build off of this or move forward based on that point. So the previous two sections of the presentation started to trace out how modern civilization has arrived at this opposite idea of consciousness. This opposite idea is physicalism. It's paramount to acknowledge the detrimental impact this has had on education and the urgency with which this issue must be unhesitatingly confronted. Any educational system that spreads this misconception must be deemed bogus from an unbiased perspective, because if the foundation is faulty, then the structure is also compromised. So now this is a very sobering reflection on and a call to action based upon these kind of insights that have been shared by Dr. Puri, because taking this physicalist idea on is so self-destructive and is causing so much havoc on the educational systems across our civilization, human civilization. So it's really an act of compassion and mercy for someone who can see beyond that and to say, hey, this is very important. This is really harming a lot of people, all these mental health issues that we're seeing, all these, so many problems people are having, all this competition for resources, trying to assert dominance over one another, causing wars, all these things which are so prevalent at this very moment in history. This all stems from not recognizing consciousness as fundamental, recognizing consciousness as an instrument of a self, recognizing that finite self as an instrument of an infinite universal self, and recognizing that the harmony of all finite things rests in its relation to that infinite absolute context. It's really an important lesson, a non-sectarian, this is non-sectarian principles. This is not trying to put forward some, so sectarian means we're trying to tell principles from a very limited perspective, which only are relevant to an emotional group of people who are basing their knowledge on belief rather than a rational development of thought, which is applicable to all living entities. So a non-sectarian means this is something which is applicable to all living entities, something which is true whether you identify with this group or another group. No matter what group you identify with, these principles hold true. So this non-sectarian message is very important, and it can help so many people if they start to adjust the way they think in this way and are humble enough to recognize mistakes that have been made, and hopeful enough to move forward in the right direction, and associate with those who are also trying to move in the right direction. So this is really a compassionate call to action here based on what has been shared. So in the last few slides here, we'll just talk about what we mean by consciousness is a very broad thing, and it's more complicated than just the confines of a single term. So all of the components of consciousness, the science of what consciousness means, has been very systematically and competently given by a German philosopher named G.W.F. Hegel, especially in his book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel's book was subtitled The Science of the Experience of Consciousness. It describes forms of consciousness such as sense certainty, perception, understanding, self-consciousness, and reason. The general public is more familiar with terms like mind, ego, self, the false self, and intelligence, which make up consciousness, in addition to spirit, which is beyond consciousness. So this is kind of showing how this knowledge has existed historically in our Western civilization, by thinkers like Hegel, and it goes into the nuances of what we mean by consciousness. The purposes of this presentation, we're using the word consciousness, but really the science of that, going into the education of that, is very nuanced, and there's a lot of rich things to learn. So this is the point of making these last couple of points. There's a really rich depth to dive into when we talk about consciousness and self-consciousness and spirit, and the development to those higher levels from the senses and mind and ego. In the past, both in the East and West, such as with the ancient Sankhya philosophy, these components of consciousness have been described in a dualistic way as subtle matter and gross matter, where there's a dichotomy between matter of the five senses, which are gross, and the matter of consciousness, which is subtle. They did basically, in terms of our presentation here, they divided the consciousness and the content of consciousness into two opposing antithetical principles. This kind of development in the West was led by people like Descartes, who wanted to separate res cogitans, or mind, and res extensa, as matter, and then prioritize the study of matter. At the end of the last section, we tried to show the three steps, how that can occur within consciousness. So we try to show how that happens, and how it's still within consciousness, even though consciousness is believing content is external to itself. So all of this has been summarized in one verse in Bhagavad Gita, actually. All of this meaning the relationship of the senses being instruments of the mind being instrument of the intelligence being an instrument of consciousness, the consciousness being an instrument of the self, and the self being the instrument of the super self. This is given in one verse in Bhagavad Gita. This verse says, Indriyani paranyahor indriyebhya paramana manashastu parabudhir yobudhe paratastusha. This is verse 3.42, chapter 3, text 42. We start with the senses, and beyond them is the mind, then digging deeper is intelligence or discriminating power, still deeper is reason, and beyond them is the self. So the point of showing this is this knowledge has been around forever. Right? The Bhagavad Gita is an ancient text. What we're saying here is not new. It's only been forgotten through the course of history. This has always been there. The knowledge has always been available for us to return to. So spiritual teachers have cautioned us not to make the mistake of conflating the true self as a subordinate instrument of the whole for the false self, which is a sense of self as a doer, or a superordinate solipsism, where we think just our self exists and everything is outside of ourself. We already addressed this. So the false self conceives itself independently as a whole within itself. Basically, it's presuming itself to be God. And this becomes a problem when confronted by other selves. This leads to competition and violence, actually. So, in the book, Dr. Pori gives us this nice graph or picture that we put in the bottom right corner, which is showing going from an egocentric false ego, where we find ourselves in the center of reality, going to a theocentric true reality, where we are an instrument for the true center, which is God, the infinite, the absolute, the foundation which is self-caused, and of which we are inherently dependent upon. So philosophy has faltered at this point in recognizing the subordination of the self rather than its superordination. Philosophy has only, it hasn't connected, it hasn't shown that the self is a dependent entity. So it has to take a hint from religion here. And then once it takes that hint, the thoughtfulness and rationality of philosophy can help to establish the rationality of religion. That's what we're trying to do here, to then highlight the scientific basis of religion in a non-sectarian way. So this is similar to what happened in history, what Immanuel Kant had to establish. As a philosopher, he had to establish the rationality of science. This is in the late 1600s, early 1700s, when empirical science was developing, but the thoughts underlying it were not so flushed out. Kant was able to do that, but it came only after science started to develop. So history has undergone a Copernican inversion or reversal in relation to how it sees the relationship between consciousness and matter. As we showed in this last section, consciousness being fundamental was known in ancient times. So they used to see the world from the perspective of a conscious perspective. But then they switched and they moved to seeing a world as primary. And then they looked at consciousness from that worldly perspective. And that resulted in a material perspective of consciousness. But now we have seen the pitfalls of that as the history of human civilization continues, and we're finding our way back to that conscious viewpoint. But rather than just being a presumed religious certainty, it's turned into a scientific proof or truth, why it's necessary to see consciousness as fundamental and to see matter as a degradation of that conscious perspective. This is actually an example of what Hegel calls the labor of the negative, where the development of thought or consciousness moves from a thesis to an antithesis or its negation, and then to a synthesis, which is basically the reconciliation of the thesis and antithesis in a higher understanding. So this is why we're saying the consciousness being primary used to be held as a religious certainty in ancient times. But this ended up faltering and they went to a materialistic perspective. But now finally we're seeing how detrimental that was, and we're returning to that consciousness perspective, but we're seeing the necessity for it now. So it's now turned to a scientific proof or truth. So similarly, the Copernican revolution, right, from a geocentric view to a heliocentric view, it didn't just come from people deciding to change their minds, but through careful study and understanding of how heliocentrism was a more superior explanation of what was being observed. So in the same way, we're experiencing a kind of Copernican revolution here. That consciousness rather than matter is fundamental. So now we just have these last few points about the part. We're a part of that whole, which is conscious. So why can we ascribe consciousness or self-consciousness to the whole? Because we are a part of it. We can confirm in our direct experience that we are self-conscious. We can reflect on our own behavior. We can reflect on the things we like, the things we don't like. We can adapt our behavior. So this is all self-consciousness, but we're finite entities. We rely on things outside of ourselves. We rely on the context which is outside of us. We rely on the whole which is outside of us. And because, as finite entities with the capacity for self-consciousness, that means the whole of which we're a part must have that quality in itself. That quality of self-consciousness only lies within us because we're part of that self-conscious whole. So in the same way, Dr. Pori simplifies this by telling about pizza, right? If you have a slice of pizza, the properties of that slice of pizza are as they are because they're coming from a whole pizza which has those same properties. And the part is derived from that whole. Similarly, the organic whole has consciousness, has selfhood. This is the universal self, universal self-consciousness. So in this way, we're seeing how religion and philosophy, they are learning from each other. Because again, philosophy could not understand that. They knew the whole was God in philosophy. Philosophers recognized that, but they couldn't understand the self-consciousness of the whole. But religion did. So in that way, again, philosophy can learn from religion, but help to also make a scientific foundation for it. Without consciousness, our body of flesh and blood, muscle and bones would not stand. It would just be a pile on the floor without consciousness. We have to be conscious to be erect, to stand up. When we're not conscious, our body is simply falling on the ground. In the same way, consciousness is keeping the world and the universe erect. Consciousness has foundational importance. It is the strongest force, right? Gravity, a force that we know in nature, has a strong and a weak force, but neither of them hold the body upright. The only force which holds a body upright is consciousness. So, science should inquire about this force of consciousness. Consciousness not only holds the universe up, but it also creates it. This is not reducing the subjective to our individual subjective consciousness. Rather, again, there is a universal which we're a part of. This is just trying to show that this is a universal we're a part of. It gives an example of trees, right? We see trees in nature. Each of those trees are different from each other, but they belong to a higher category which unifies them. Ultimately, this higher concept which unifies all the different human beings, all the different living entities, that highest concept of which we're all part, which is a unity in diversity, that is the universal, that is God, the organic whole. So once the importance of this development of consciousness-based education is understood and has penetrated deep into the self through all layers of intelligence, mind, and senses, then we can recognize that every individual has a relationship with that organic whole, with that supreme person. And this is the highest and most subtle plane of reality. It's the most subtle plane. We have to be very mindful when we're approaching this kind of knowledge. It can't be conceived through the senses or reason. It can only be through faith and love. This is the relationship. Once we can arrive at the necessity for consciousness and self-consciousness and how the whole also has these properties through reason. But once we get to this understanding, that relation between the part and the whole and the development of that relation, this can only be developed through faith and love. But now faith and love have a very scientific foundation to stand on. And following the non-sectarian principles of Vaishnavism, being humble, being more humble than a tree, more humble than a blade of grass, more tolerant than a tree, and giving all respect to others without expecting it in return. This is what has been presented here about the necessity of consciousness as being fundamental and the development of that to its highest degree in relationship with the organic whole. This is the ontology of Vaishnavism, this non-sectarian system of scientific personalism. And this has been taught by the Vaishnava acharyas, how this relates to every person, no matter what group they relate to. Everything ultimately finds its context in that relation with the self-conscious whole. And this is the end of our presentation here.
Thank you so much for the It was quite enlightening and uh, very interesting, and makes you think a lot about uh, how we usually trained to perceive reality, and how we are usually trained to think. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Prabhu. Thank you for taking an interest. So we'll finish. I'll first pay our respects to the Vaishnava acharyas, to the spiritual teachers who have helped us to come to this kind of understanding. Om Gyanatimiran Hasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshur Militam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. And to all the sincere seekers who have, devotees who have helped and encouraged us along the way. Vanchakalpa Tuyabhyascha Kripa Sindhubhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namah. Take care, Prabhu.
You too. And if you plan to make other presentation and transmit it live, I will be happy to join. Just please let us know.
Yes, I will, Prabhu. Yes. We look forward to the next time we see you.
Yeah, absolutely. Nice to
Take
see
care.
you. Bye.